She had imagined 100 ways the day could go wrong, but none of them had arrived as a single, clean cut. Rafael's absence from the doorway, his silence turned into a tiny, obscene message. "I'm sorry, I can't do this." And the church folding around her like a mouthful of whispers. Beatriz stood at the altar in a dress that felt heavier than the thought of marriage. Lace clung to her shoulders. The bouquet in her hand smelled faintly of lilies and something else, nervous perfume from a dozen women leaning forward to see if the rumor was true. Candles threw thin light across the marble, but it was the flash of cameras and the low, sharp rustle of phones that filled the space. She could feel the pastor's eyes on her, polite and awkward, wanting the ceremony to be a thing that continued regardless. The organist's fingers hesitated on a chord. Beside her, her father's jaw worked like a mouth trying to make a decision. The message had come 15 minutes before the processional. Beatriz had stared at Rafael's name until the blue bubble blurred, until the letters became useless symbols. She had tried calling. She had paced behind the organ, answering 100 tentative hugs from guests who smelled like cologne and moralizing curiosity. When she'd finally allowed herself to read the 2 words, her hands had gone cold. She heard the church breathe around her, assuming, filling in. It was always worse that way. People crowded to invent reasons for a man's cowardice rather than see a woman's bewilderment. The whispers started soft, like silk rubbing together, and grew teeth. Someone took a video, someone else sent a photo, a cousin of a friend streamed live. It would be over the internet faster than she could blink. Then Rodrigo Tavares stood. Rodrigo had been at one of the front pews as a courtesy to the family. He had always been a courteous man, so precise in gestures that they looked rehearsed. He wore a dark suit that sat on his shoulders like an armor built from a tailor's memory. He had come to the wedding because he was her boss, and because he had accepted invitations when he chose to. He had come for reasons that had nothing to do with the afternoon's impending disaster. He moved through a swirl of silk and phone screens with slow, deliberate steps. People opened like curtains. The murmuring halted long enough to give him an aisle. Beatriz watched him advance and felt a ridiculous, unhelpful flare of anger. At him, at the world, at the man who had chosen to write a line and vanish. His voice, when he reached the altar, was low, flat, and sharp enough to carve the shape of a decision. "Beatriz," he said, and he addressed her as if they were in a conference room and she had missed a meeting. "I'm going to say something that will sound mad, but listen." Her father's hand on her arm tightened. The pastor blinked, unsurely. "If you want me to, I'll stand there. I'll say the names. I'll sign as a witness. I'll let this be over." He turned only slightly, and his gaze brushed the rows, the cameras, the phones. "Finger que su noivo." The words landed with the weight of an impossible offer. "Pretend I'm the groom." It was absurd. It was a theatrical, almost cinematic rescue. It should have angered her. How dare he step into such a private humiliation with a public solution? But anger was a luxury she could not afford in that moment. Around her, the church held its breath. Beatriz looked at Rodrigo. He was expressionless. There was a small scar at his brow that she had noticed before and tried to forget. He smelled of something warm and barky when he was close. The office again, the caramel coffee that always seemed to cling to his collar. In that scent, she heard the quiet fact that he was a man who preferred order to messiness. He offered her a way out, an immediate deflection from the cameras and the tongues. Her father's whisper at her ear was a frantic, "What?" Her friend Julia's fingers, surprisingly steady, pressed into the small of her back. A dozen gazes waited for an answer that would either complete the spectacle or end it gracefully. If she refused, the pastor could excuse them, the band could fumble, and the parish would exit with an air of scandal wrapped around everyone like a damp shawl. If she accepted, she could step off that altar in a different way, shielded by a man whose presence silenced gossip, at least temporarily. Rodrigo's wealth and his reputation would be a thin armor, yes, but armor all the same. Beatriz raised the bouquet and then lowered it. Her voice was small. "If you do this, Rodrigo, you understand. This is only for tonight, for the guests, for the cameras." He nodded, a motion precise enough to be contractual. For tonight. The pastor blinked twice, uncertain whether the ritual could proceed. Rodrigo moved as if he had planned the choreography. He slipped a hand, measured, not possessive, around the small of her back and guided her into place. The organ played the same arrangements as before. Vows were said, but they were thinner, the words rearranged to accommodate a truth everyone was keeping from themselves. Rodrigo's mouth brushed her temple in a formal kiss, public but contained, and the cameras hungrily ate it up. Outside, the flash of phones drew them away like a second procession. The reception hall was a golden room, full of forced smiles and sympathetic clinking of glasses. People drank champagne for reasons that had nothing to do with celebration. Julia hovered like a good nurse. "You could have left," she said once they were alone for a breath on the balcony, the city a smear of light beyond the glass. Her voice was blunt in its tenderness. "Don't tell me you were thinking of staying through this charade forever." Beatrice's laugh was thin, a dry sound she'd been saving. "It's not a charade, it's—" She searched for a word that didn't make the evening worse. "It's dignity, in a different shape." Rodrigo watched her with the same calm he brought to presentations, measured attention, taking notes with his eyes. He did not pry. Instead, he offered an efficient solution. "There's a suite at the hotel across the street. My people can hold anything you need. You don't have to go home tonight if you don't want the calls," and his voice clipped a little. He had chosen to be practical rather than sentimental. "You can be alone without everybody watching." It was an offer dressed in propriety, and Beatriz accepted because she wanted a place where the lenses couldn't find her. Later, in the privacy of the hotel's mirrored hallways, the world would condense to the small, ordinary act of taking off a dress and letting the skin breathe. She felt both ridiculously childish and gratefully grateful. Somewhere between the toast and the cake, someone recorded Rodrigo speaking at the head table, "Tonight, we'll call it a night with grace." The clip would be edited and shared with the ease of a thumb slide. The internet took brightness and reduced it to a rumor. Photos of the two of them, Rodrigo with the suit-like armor, Beatriz with a wistful, practiced smile, began to travel even before the night had cooled. The suite smelled like hotel soap and a faint, deliberate citrus that suggested quiet hospitality. Rodrigo stood by the window, not assuming anything, giving Beatriz space to decide what she needed. When she walked across the room, the fabric of the dress sighed. She dropped the bouquet into a wastebasket, a small rebellion. "You could have gone home," she said again, softer now, because in the privacy of the room, anger rounded into exhaustion. "I don't know why you were humiliated in public," he said. His voice lost its corporate edge for a beat. It was the nearest thing to an explanation he offered. "That's not acceptable." "No, it's very acceptable for people to do that and practice their gossip," she muttered. "It's just awful." He did not reach for her then. Instead, he called his assistant and arranged for her driver to have a different route home if she wanted. He did a dozen small administrative tasks with the quiet conviction of a man who believed in systems. It struck her, unpleasantly, that he treated crisis like an item on a to-do list and managed it the same way he managed budgets and mergers. But she liked that about him. It made the world less hysterical. The next morning the feeds were full. The wedding that was not a wedding had 1,000 faces and 0 explanations. Why did she stay? Jasmine, an on-screen pundit with a jawline like a question mark, asked into a studio camera. 1,000 strangers had their own theories, and they made them loud and flat. Her inbox filled with messages and judgments. The company's PR team received calls from reporters who smelled the story as if it were a scandalous perfume. Beatriz walked into work the following Monday with the same dress she had slept in for 3 hours, wrapped up in a safe place and a head full of sleep that had been too shallow to count. She had not expected the office to be a battlefront, yet it had transformed overnight into a glass arena where whispers echoed off the windows. Her co-workers' eyes were brief and full of opinions. Some of them looked at her with a kind of professional pity, others with a thinly veiled hunger for details. Someone had already posted a montage of the wedding on a gossip site, an edited highlight reel set to triumphant pop. Rodrigo had called a meeting. The conference room smelled like coffee and new ink. He was at the head of the table, immaculately composed, hair in place, his fingers folded on a folder that matched the rest of his efficiency. He did not let emotion fill the room. He controlled the volume of the office as if he had a remote. "Listen," he said, "this is not a PR stunt. It's a situation we manage and move past." He looked directly at her, without indulgence but without shame. "We will keep this professional. There will be rules." The rules were practical and precise. Do not engage with speculation. Do not post personal images or comments on social media. Maintain work schedules. In meetings, treat the situation as non-existent. He assigned a single, discreet contact from PR to field external queries. He told them there would be no public statements unless they agreed on one together. In his voice, there was an attempt at fairness. Protect her dignity and protect the company's image. He was trying to create boundaries where the world had none. "But Rodrigo," Ana Paula said, frowning, "what about legally? If—" He cut her off with a line that startled. "We'll get legal counsel. For now, we keep things quiet and professional. You all are expected to continue with your responsibilities." His eyes softened on Beatriz for the smallest of fragments. "If anyone crosses a line, you tell me. Security will intervene." It was an unusual promise coming from a man who seemed to prefer systems over promises. Beatriz felt the tug between relief and a resistor, a worry that his intervention would morph into control. She swallowed that thought because at the moment what she needed was to be allowed to work, without the world calling her pain a spectacle. The office gossip slowly moved from the conference room into private chats. People messaged each other with speculation about motives, but the rules held, the open speculation at least. Rodrigo's instructions had weight because he was in the center of it. Some argued that being married to the boss, temporary or otherwise, changed dynamics irrevocably. She heard that and felt a small, cold panic. He had offered her a sanctuary, and also he'd handed her another problem, a relationship with a man for whom the balance of power was never neutral. Later that afternoon, his lawyer's voice arrived via a brief formal email. Legal realities would complicate a tidy exit. An annulment was possible, but dependent on grounds that might not apply. Divorce would be more straightforward, but would require waiting periods and filings. In their correspondence, the figure 6 months appeared, a number that felt like a length of time, sketched on a calendar and then set in concrete. It meant living under a label in public for months. It meant the world could keep shaping the narrative before they could control it. Rodrigo left the legal details to the lawyers. He explained to Beatriz bluntly and without color that a swift, clean erasure of what had happened would be unlikely. He suggested the divorce route as a pragmatic way to separate them legally without the need for an annulment that would drag through vague proofs. Beatriz tried to pass the difference between being married by the state and being married in a photograph. Both felt like cages of different materials. She asked questions about witnesses and the certidão, about how a piece of paper could keep her tethered to an event born of necessity. Rodrigo answered with the clarity of someone used to complicated logistics. Because witnesses signed, because there was a ceremony, the registry might not be able to be nullified immediately. The law is precise in odd ways, he said. If we file for divorce, it will be a process. We can prepare to file, but until then, you're technically my wife on paper." She felt anger blossom then, at the mechanics of it, at the absurdity. "So I'm supposed to live my life pretending." Her words were sharp and self-aware. "Pretending to be married to my boss while the internet stitches stories around us. It's not forever," he said. "But the reality is, you might have to make practical choices for your reputation and safety." She hated how practical the world was. She wanted a speech, a hero, an anthem. Instead, she had a spreadsheet of legal outcomes and a man who refused to be a knight in any romantic sense. He was offering contingency plans, boundaries, and an unwavering insistence on consent. It was the sort of support that felt like a sterile bandage, not a balm. They settled into a strange new pattern. Rodrigo made his expectations plain. They would keep physical distance at work, they would not travel together unannounced, and they would have one scheduled meeting a week to coordinate any external communications. If anyone asked about the wedding, they would say they had decided to wait and address privacy together. If there was harassment, they would file complaints. "You're giving people a framework to judge you," Julia said one evening over a late coffee when Beatriz confided the terms. They sat at a small table in a cafe that seemed to move at the tempo of ordinary life, a tempo Beatriz envied. Julia's hands were restless. "They're going to make all sorts of headlines," Julia went on. "They'll say you stayed for attention or money or that you're manipulating the boss. None of it will be true, but they will say it anyway." "Better them than me," Beatrice whispered. "Better a rumor than a broken family. Better that everything is edited into a clip than filmed live." It was the sort of thought that made her feel weak and simultaneously more than she was allowed to be. She liked being dignified. She liked making choices that kept her from spectacle. If that meant living a lie for a while, she could do it. Except the while was now clocked, tabulated into months. She had her pride, but she also had practicality. Rodrigo respected the need for discretion. He started to present gestures that were careful rather than grand. He would hand her a coffee in the morning and then walk on, never lingering into anything that could be mistaken for ownership. When the office kitchen filled with chatter about the wedding, he held to his doctrine, work first. He praised her in meetings in front of others with the straightforwardness of a man who respected competence. He nominated her for a project that was visible and demanding, a way of giving her professional momentum that would not be easily explained as a favor for affection. Beatriz accepted. She did not want to be a charity case. Their proximity in the office became a study in restraint. Sometimes, when the lights dimmed and the building emptied, their conversations were practical. Deadlines, an errant supplier, a budget review. But once, when she returned to the office late to retrieve a document that her team had overlooked, Rodrigo was there, waiting by the elevator. He held the envelope out to her with both hands, as if it were sacred. She took it. The air between them tightened in a manner that felt like someone pulling a thread taut. There was an invisible line they both knew not to cross, the boss-subordinate line, the line that could be used by others to paint a portrait that neither wanted. Beatrice's fingers brushed his. It was nothing and everything, a contact that registered like a spark to the skin. She looked up, and for the briefest fraction of a second she saw something unarmored in his expression, an echo of the man at the altar who had offered her an impossible favor without asking for payment. "Good night," he said. It was the smallest of courtesies, and the elevator closed. That evening she lay awake thinking about the touch as if it were a question that needed answering. It was an intimate thing, the simple press of two hands. It could be misread, weaponized, or it could be nothing more than a hand returning a piece of paper. The world would be quick to choose an interpretation. 2 weeks into the charade, the first true human moment happened in a way that neither of them had scheduled. Julia called crying over a breakup she hadn't expected. It was late. The city was full of the kind of noises that made grief seem more intense. A dog barking, a siren, couples arguing under the street lamps. Beatriz sat in the living room in sweatpants with the weight of the week on her shoulders and listened to her friend unravel. Rodrigo found out because he was practical. Julia had texted him by mistake, asking if he knew of any good counselors. He had not answered her directly. He had done what Rodrigo did. He had arranged for a therapist, a practical contact, and he had left the number for Julia's mother to pass along. Then he had sent a message to Beatriz. "Come over if you want." She was hesitant. She did not want to become someone who smoothed over other people's raw places for reasons that blurred into sentiment she could not yet afford. But when she arrived at his apartment, sweating from a walk that had been intentionally long to buy courage, he met her at the door with a bowl of soup like something from another century, nourishing, minimal, quiet. He did not ask for a report. He put the soup down, sat, and gave her a plate. There was no pretension, no attempt to fill the silence with important words. Julia spoke in ruptures. Beatriz listened and held her hand. Rodrigo kept to the edges of the room like a calm presence. At one point, when Julia's voice broke, Beatriz looked up and found Rodrigo's gaze steady on her. He said softly, "You did the right thing coming." It was not praise exactly. It was an observation that contained both recognition and a permission to be human. Later, as Julia slept on the couch with a blanket that had belonged to Beatriz's grandmother, the apartment shrank to a domestic fragment. Rodrigo offered her his spare key, an oddly intimate gesture cloaked in usefulness, and they sat in the kitchen with 2 cups of black coffee. The light in his place was warm and low in contrast to the city's blare. He asked nothing of her, and she responded by talking. She talked about the small humiliations, the comments, the look of pity, the way people thought they could rewrite a woman's narrative with a line in a caption. "You were brave," he said, finally. It was the first time he had used a word like that about her. There was no flattery, only a fact presented with the weight of non-negotiable evidence. She swallowed, surprised and a little disarmed. "Maybe brave is the wrong word," she admitted. "Maybe I was just avoiding a worse spectacle." "And that's allowed," he said. "It's allowed to choose a small dignity over a public breakdown." His hands were on his cup, careful and steady. There was a temptation to look for more in those hands, to imagine them different. Beatriz felt the pulse of something dangerous and potentially beautiful, a mutual attraction that could be framed as care or misread as convenience. Underneath every decision was the reality of the power gap. She recognized that, and she named it when the conversation deepened. "We need rules," she said. Her voice was firm. "Because if there aren't rules, everything becomes a rumor, and then—" She found the word that had become her lodestar. "Consent is meaningless when people assume things for you." He nodded, and for a moment his expression admitted a private admission. He had thought of that too. "I proposed rules at the office," he said. "I'll propose them here too. Transparency where necessary. No surprises, no pressure, clear boundaries." He looked at her with an intensity that did not seek to own, but to assure. "If anything happens between us, it has to be because both of us chose it, not because of a circumstance." Beatriz felt the unfairness of the world in that sentence. They had begun under duress, but they agreed to make whatever came next be owned rather than inherited. She liked the thought that consent could be made literal and repeated, not a one-time checkbox, but something they would keep choosing daily and explicitly. When he reached across the table to pour her another cup of coffee, their fingers brushed, again small electricities. She searched his face for mischief or invitation. He met her gaze and smiled, nothing theatrical, only contained. "We are not children," he said matter of fact. "We'll handle it like adults." She appreciated the adultness of it. It was a relief that did not annihilate the complexity. There were no grand declarations there, just a pair of grown people arranging sensible rules. It was the sort of intimacy she could live with, practical, deliberate, respectful of agency. But people didn't live inside that kitchen. Outside, the world spun the images into new shapes. The feeds had become a gallery. Headlines challenged her morality like a gauntlet. There were comments that called her naive, and others that called her opportunistic. The ex, Rafael, had become a ghost with the power to vanish. 2 days later, he resurfaced in the most ordinary way, a message with a punctuation that tried to dress regret. It read, "Beatriz, can we talk?" She read it on the subway, the screen a white smear in her hand. The message sat like a stone in her lap. She did not respond. She forwarded it to Rodrigo with a single line, "What do you want me to do?" His reply was quick and devoid of sensation. "Ignore. If he wants to speak, let him speak to me." Rodrigo's words felt protective and possessive in equal measure. She bristled at ownership. She was not property to be guarded, but she also felt grateful that someone would not let an ex stage a second spectacle. He had made the choice to adopt the role of protector because it fixed the immediate problem. She had accepted because it fixed the thing that hurt most, the shame of being the center of a public joke. She did not answer Rafael's message. That night, she sat by the window in her small apartment, the city lights casting a subway map of neon across the floor, and felt the shape of her life change incrementally, like a house remodeling itself room by room, not with catastrophe but with tiny renovations. She had won a shelter from a storm at the cost of a label she'd have to wear for months. She had met a man who made rules and kept them, who was capable of tenderness but managed emotion like a spreadsheet. It was not love yet. It was something else, proximity and possibility, and the obligation to make careful choices. The weeks that followed were a lesson in navigation. They learned to speak in clarifying sentences, to de-escalate assumptions, to insist on explicit consent for any intimate move. For every media wave that rose and crashed, there were 3 mundane acts that steadied them. Rodrigo recommending her for a leadership role on a public project, Beatriz staying late and sending him updates that cut to the chase, Julia calling with petty complaints that scented life with the ordinary. And then, on a rainy Thursday, in a corridor slick with the smell of wet coats and urgency, they found themselves alone for a stretch of minutes that felt like a poem. She had been arguing a point in a meeting, and the adrenaline still hummed in her limbs. He approached with a folder in hand. "You did well in there," he said. She smiled, tired and guarded. "Thanks." For reasons neither of them fully articulated, the corridor seemed to narrow into a single light. The building's heating hummed like a stomach. He held her gaze longer than was necessary. He lifted a hand and, with entirely deliberate slowness, tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear. It was an old gesture, gentle, domestic, and it landed differently against the electricity in her chest. Beatriz's breath hitched, and for a moment the world outside the corridor fell away. She had imagined this touch 1,000 times in different contexts, after a victory, after a fight. But the reality was sharper than her imaginings. The gesture had to be reciprocal by choice, not assumption. She remembered their rules, their vows to keep consent clear. "Do you—" she started, uncertain of the verb. He put his finger lightly to his lips and whispered, "May I?" It was a ridiculous adult request, like asking permission to open a window. It was thoughtful and terribly intimate. His voice was small in that corridor, yet it carried a lifetime of restraint. She nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Yes," she said. It was an explicit consent, a deliberate granting. He closed the distance then, but not in a way that consumed. He kissed her with an attention that asked and then accepted the answer. It was not cinematic. It was not urgent. It was a slow discovery, a verification of taste and breath. When he broke away, both of them took a visible breath, as if they'd been given permission to exhale. They stood there awkward and luminous, aware of the precariousness of the moment. It had happened because they had named the possibility and held one another accountable. It felt like a beginning and a betrayal at the same time. The world outside the corridor could choose to flatten any nuance into a headline. Inside, they shared a small, fragile reality. She straightened her jacket. Her heart sounded loud in her ears. "We need to be careful," she said, the words a shape between them. "We will be," he replied. He smiled, again contained, not indulgent, and for a second he seemed like a man willing to learn to be gentle on purpose. The elevator doors opened. They stepped in and rode down in silence that was not empty. There were decisions to make, consequences to reckon with. The legal clock that hung over them like a ceiling lamp was still lit. The folder of options, the lawyer's 6-month timeline, the witnesses and the certidome. Public perception would not be patient. As the elevator reached the lobby, a notification tone buzzed across Beatriz's phone. She glanced down without wanting to look. A link to a headline, Rodrigo Tavares and coordinator Beatriz Almeida, an unlikely wedding. The article was clinical, reductive. The comments below were quick to fill with verdicts. She felt something like resolve harden inside her then. Maybe this entire arrangement would teach her how to choose from the inside out rather than be chosen for spectacle. Maybe it would teach them to build something honest in a space that began as a lie. But there were trials ahead. Legal forms that couldn't be ignored, the court's calendar and its patience, their colleagues' judgments, Rafael's eventual, inevitable attempt to re-enter the script. There would be nights when the kindness they negotiated would not suffice against the weight of shame. There would be moments when one would want out and the other would have to allow it. For now they had a kiss, a set of rules, and a city that didn't sleep. They had consent as their compass, and the knowledge that every public image hereafter would need to be earned with truth, rather than prettified with explanation. They stepped into the rain. The world waited. They stepped into the rain and let the city close around them like a secret. Streetlights smeared halos on the wet pavement. Cars hissed past. Cameras still flashed from distant angles. The night had not finished harvesting images. Rodrigo hailed a car with the efficiency of someone who kept a list of contingencies, and when they slid into the back seat, neither spoke for a while. Beatriz watched raindrops sketch lines along the window and thought of how many people were filling in their own versions of her story while she rode in silence. By morning, the internet had already invented chapters she hadn't lived through, clips looped on social feeds, Rodrigo's kiss at the altar, the way Beatriz had smiled when cameras cut too close, the slow walk down the church aisle. The comments were a chorus of verdicts. Some were cruel, some thirsty for scandal, others oddly admiring. None of them were helpful. Later that day, Rodrigo arranged for a lawyer to stop by her desk with discreet efficiency. The lawyer was polite, the kind of person trained to make discomfort sound like procedure. "We need to be realistic," he said, setting a folder between them. "Your marriage is on record because the registry issued the certidome and witnesses signed. Annulment is uncertain without specific grounds. Divorce is the cleaner route, but it takes time, 6 months or more depending on jurisdiction and whether we file uncontested. The important thing now is to protect your interests while we prepare." Beatriz listened and tried to feel nothing. Practical words clacked against the hollow of her chest. She had accepted one kind of shame to avoid another. Now the paperwork asked her to live with a new kind, living publicly under a label she had never chosen. The lawyer's neutral voice made it sound neutral, like a new line item on a very bad spreadsheet. Rodrigo's presence at the meeting was steady but unobtrusive. He did not monopolize the conversation. When the lawyer mentioned potential complications, witnesses retracting statements, televised testimonies, or a press hunger for any scandal involving his company, Rodrigo's eyes tightened into an expression Beatriz had begun to learn was equivalent to, "I will handle this." After the meeting, in the hallway outside the small conference room, she let herself speak the question that had been burning since the altar. "Do you want me to leave? To make it easier for you?" Rodrigo's hands were in his pockets. The motion looked deliberate. "I don't want you to make yourself small," he said. "I don't want you to live as if you owe me anything. That said, if we're going to be seen as married for a while, I'd rather the things you need to be safe and dignified be the priority." It was an answer that meant something practical more than something romantic. Security, not salvation. She accepted that. It soothed something taut inside her, more than any declaration of affection could. The days that followed were a calculus of small protective acts. Rodrigo instituted workplace rules that echoed through the company. No private travel together. Professional reporting lines adjusted so Beatriz would no longer report directly to him. And an HR liaison appointed to handle any harassment complaints. It was immediate mitigation. It was also, Beatriz knew, necessary to prevent the charge that the faked marriage had translated into career favors. She appreciated that he understood optics as well as law. When he proposed her for a visible leadership position on a high-profile project, one that would make her visible for competence, not gossip, she almost refused out of reflex. Rodrigo overruled that reflex with the same thing he'd shown at the altar, quiet insistence. "You earned this," he said in his office, handing over the project brief. "You want to be considered for the role?" Her answer was a guarded yes. She wanted a stake in what people would eventually write about her, a portfolio of work they could not reduce to a headline. Work became an anchor. The project demanded late nights and careful decision-making. In the fluorescent hush of the office, under the pressure of deliverables, Beatriz rediscovered herself in the small, habitual ways. Leading a meeting, offering precise critique, watching a team take an idea from whiteboard to execution. People started to meet their deadlines. People started to look to her with a grudging respect that had nothing to do with wedding photos. But the public appetite for their story refused to cool. A tabloid reached out to Rodrigo's PR, implying they had exclusive material from someone who had been at the reception. The message wore the veneer of civility. "We'd like a comment." But underneath, the intent was to dig. Rodrigo did not deny the approach. Instead, he responded as he always had. He built a plan that neutralized the most dangerous angles. He authorized a formal statement that addressed nothing more than the truth they shared, that they would make no public comment on private legal matters, and he instructed his team to refuse all offers. "You can't control what they'll say," he told her one evening as they walked home, umbrellas forgotten and shoulders damp. "But you can control how you respond. Silence in this case is protective." It was a policy for living as much as a PR tactic. She learned to compartmentalize work, rules, private life, until one of the compartments loosened its screws. It happened one slow Sunday night when Beatriz was staying at her own apartment and found herself unable to sleep. She had been awake thinking about a budget review for the new project and the mental list of things that needed fixing. Her phone buzzed with a message she resisted opening. It was from Rafael, a short sentence, 2 words that tried to be a confession. "I'm sorry." She stared at those words like an animal hearing a trap snap shut. She thought of the empty stretch of aisle, the way he had looked down as if someone else had drawn his courage. For a moment she entertained that old, brittle hope. Maybe there would be an explanation, a reason that made cowardice legible, but she had had enough of making room for explanations that never came. Instead, she forwarded the message to Rodrigo and wrote, "He wants to talk." His reply was fast. "Bring him to me if he insists, otherwise ignore." Rafael's second approach arrived 2 days later, this time a phone call to her desk at work. He asked for a meeting, said he had made a mistake, and wanted to apologize in person. The temptation to accept vanished as quickly as it rose. She sent a one-line response: "I will not meet you. Do not contact me again." Not much later, she received a call that was not from Rafael, but from someone who claimed to be his sister, asking if he could speak to her. Beatriz blocked the number. She filed the call into the corner of her mind, reserved for inconvenient ghosts. A larger problem emerged the week after. An envelope arrived at the office, hand-delivered to Rodrigo's assistant and marked legal. Beatriz watched him open it in his office and felt the color drain from his face as he read. The papers were divorce papers, quite literal, the sort that required signature and initialing in very specific places. They had been prepared by a firm that specialized in high-profile divorces, the sort that could be easily leaked to hungry presses if mishandled. "They're tentatively filed," Rodrigo said later, showing her the documents across his desk. "My lawyer was preparing them as contingency, to be filed if we chose to take that path. The question is whether we file or whether we don't. If we file and make this uncontested, we can shorten the process, but it still takes months. If we don't file and we keep the status quo, the world continues to have a legal marriage to dissect." He folded his hands in a way that looked like a man closing a business plan. "You should decide. I will not decide for you." That night she lay awake and counted months, one by one. 6 months felt like an ocean when measured against her current life. They had agreed, in the practical way they had arranged so many things, that whatever choice they made would be mutual. Still, when the papers arrived, the theoretical choice turned raw. They tried to treat the decision like any other operational problem. They scheduled a meeting with the lawyers and went through scenarios. They considered the consequences of filing for divorce, the quickness of procedure if handled cooperatively against the potential of a messy public fight if contested. They weighed the personal ramifications. Would filing a divorce now make it obvious they had used the arrangement to boost careers? Would it free them legally, but leave their reputations battered? "It's not just about the paperwork," Beatriz said in the meeting, surprising herself with how calm she sounded. "It's about what we want, not what the papers say." Rodrigo looked at her then, with an intensity that made the lawyer pause mid-sentence. For a moment the practiced man slipped into something raw. "What do you want, Beatriz?" he asked. It was a question stripped of the office's armor. She thought of the altar, of the aisle, of cameras and whispers. She thought of the handful of nights they'd spent talking until dawn and the random kindnesses, soup, a spare key, the way he asked permission to kiss. She thought of the way he had proposed rules because he understood the danger before he understood the tenderness. "I don't know yet," she said, "but I know I don't want to sign away choices just because someone else decided to vanish." The lawyer suggested a middle path: delay the filing while they gathered more information and set up protective measures, an agreement that would place the divorce on provisional hold, but allow them to live their lives without immediate legal separation. It would protect them from rash filings and give them time to make a conscious decision. It was a bureaucratic compromise. Beatriz agreed. Time at first made things worse. Rumors continued, a whisper here and there, an anonymous op-ed suggesting she'd traded sex for promotion. The words hurled at her were cruel and precise. Anonymity made them sharp. Still, there were compensations that came in quieter packages. Her client complimented her presentation by name. A team member thanked her for advocating for a fair budget. Rodrigo publicly credited her leadership in a meeting that was filmed and then uploaded with no sensational captions, simply competence recognized. The pattern of living together in the margins, someone's apartment, a discreet hotel when the cameras were too close, turned into something steadier when routine intruded. They started to find themselves in the same places for undramatic reasons. sharing a taxi because they both lived near the same subway line, running into each other at a grocery store late at night when the world had shuttered its spectacle. They ate simple dinners at one another's kitchens. He did dishes, she folded the napkins, even when it didn't matter. One night, after a long week of project milestones and the hollow drainage of another media cycle, Beatriz found herself in his kitchen making tea because the kettle was the only warm thing that made sense. Rodrigo had a stack of legal briefs on the counter. She put 2 mugs on the table, and for a while they sat in companionable silence, drinking and letting the evening stretch. "I don't know what will happen with the papers," she said finally, the sentence rolling out like a small confession. "I just know I don't want any decisions. About us, about me, to be made by other people's whispers." He leaned back in his chair and considered her. "Then we don't let them," he said. "We choose consciously." The phrase lodged in her chest like a promise, not because he had uttered it as a vow, but because it was a method, choosing consciously. It suggested they could move from being actors in a narrative written by others into authors of their own pages. And then, one evening, a day that began like many others and ended like no other, they found the threshold to something that felt like more than rules and protection. They had worked late. The office lights were dim, and the city outside the glass was a cluster of indifferent stars. She had been the last to leave. Rodrigo had waited because he had something to hand her, a report she needed for Monday. He held the folder as if it were an offering. She took it. The corridors smelled of old paper and a faint lingering of coffee. They walked to the elevator together, the silence not uncomfortable. In the elevator, the building hummed and the floor numbers ticked down. The doors slid open and a cold draft hit them. She stepped out first and began walking down the wet street. He followed close enough that she was aware of his presence like the warmth of a lamp. They crossed at a corner where the light was kind. Without planning it, they stopped beneath a street tree that had its leaves catching the rain. He turned to her and for the first time said something that felt like a confession rather than an instruction. "I've been thinking about what it would mean," he said, "if we don't sign those papers, if we choose, instead of yielding to the path that everyone assumes for us." Beatriz felt the air narrow. "And what does choosing mean to you?" she asked. He paused. The city noise made a soft background. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small box she hadn't noticed he had carried. For a moment, she believed the night had played a trick. The box was small, velvet, the color of something between midnight and soil. "I know it's absurd," he said. "I know the law says our signatures are already recorded and everything is messy. But I want to ask you, properly, not as a rescue, not as a shield, but as a man who has come to understand the cost for you, and who wants to accept that cost because I want to. I want to ask you to be mine, if you'll allow me to be yours, to stay married, openly, honestly, and to build the rest of this life with intention." He sank to one knee on the wet pavement, and the city around them breathed like a thing, waiting to see what would happen. It was a gesture that would have been theatrical in another context, but in that moment it felt like gravity. Beatriz's breath caught. The absurdity and the earnestness collided in a way that made her knees go soft. "You don't have to say yes now," he added quickly, glancing up at her with an expression that was painfully tender. "Say yes when you mean yes." Her hands were suddenly full of the afternoon's fatigue and something else, a rush of memory and a hope that had been small and patient. He had not saved her that day. He had offered shelter and a choice. He had been careful when danger arrived. He had said the rules and kept them. He had, over time, become someone whose restraint felt like respect. "Do you understand what you are asking?" she asked. "To make this public, to be known as the woman who married her boss, that will change everything." He nodded. "I know the cost. I've thought about the optics and the ledger." I know we will need to be deliberate. I will propose transparency to HR. I will ensure you're not reporting to me. I will put safeguards in place, and I will fight for you in ways that are professional and visible and fair. But I won't make you say this because of a headline. She inhaled slowly. The rain had slowed to a mist. People moved around them, distant and unaware of the small drama. Beatriz looked at the box, then at his face, the scar at his brow, the careful set of his mouth, the humanness that had slipped a few times and revealed warmth. She thought about the months that had passed and the way she had begun to trust a man who had chosen to keep rules and to ask for consent. "Yes," she said, and the word landed like a decision, not because she wanted the title or because she wanted to be defended, but because she had made a choice, conscious, deliberate, and because the man before her had offered equal footing instead of ownership. He rose, and the street seemed to hold its breath. He slid the small ring, simple and not ostentatious, onto her finger. It fit. It was, in a way, a promise not to repeat the past, but to write a new chapter with intention. They kissed, not hurriedly or as a culmination, but as two people who had chosen to be together despite the mess of how they had started. They did not ignore the logistics that came with the decision. Over the next days, they informed the lawyers that they would not proceed with the divorce filing. The lawyers chewed pencils and updated calendars. Rodrigo formalized an internal disclosure to HR, acknowledging their relationship and outlining steps to prevent conflicts of interest. Beatriz would be reassigned to report to a different senior manager. Recruitment for impartial oversight on major decisions was initiated. An external auditor would review decisions that could be construed as favoritism. It was all workmanlike, bureaucratic, and precise. At the office, the announcement landed like a stone dropped in still water. Some of the ripples were hostile, an email from an anonymous employee, a whisper in the cafeteria. But many of the ripples were more human. Handshakes, cold congratulations, and a handful of colleagues who expressed genuine happiness. The promotion Rodrigo had pushed for came through, formal, public, and grounded in metrics. Beatriz accepted it with a speech that was brief and free of overlong defenses. "I'm not here because of a photograph," she said, voice steady. "I'm here because of the work my team and I have done. I'm grateful for the responsibility." Rodrigo watched from the front row with an expression that validated her. It said he had not helped her into the role for spectacle, but recognized her competence. The company instituted a short, transparent policy for executive relationships and made it public. The PR cycle was not kind, no such thing in the social age, but they had crafted a response that emphasized agency and process rather than scandal. Rafael reappeared, predictably, at the worst possible moment. He had a new account on a social platform and a camera phone. He reached out with a limpet-like persistence, first messages begging forgiveness, then offers to sell the story to tabloids for money. They had prepared for this. Rodrigo refused to let any private communication be weaponized. Beatriz sent a succinct legal cease and desist, and the lawyer forwarded a note that had teeth. When he persisted, the law caught up with him in the form of a restraining order and a request to stop harassment. The process was not instant, but it was decisive. Rafael's apology became small and self-interested. He shrank back into anonymity, and Beatriz closed that window of possibility with a deliberate click. There were crises they could not fully control. A leaked photo circulated, showing one of their first smiles together, cropped to suture a scandalous headline. Their attorneys moved quickly and won takedown notices, but they could not Google away the memory left in people's minds. Some comments lingered like grit. But increasingly, the narrative shifted. Instead of being only the woman who had been jilted, Beatriz was also the woman who had led a successful corporate rollout, who had negotiated a tough supplier contract, who had stabilized a team through a transition. The public's appetite for scandal is insatiable, but the public also admires competence when it is undeniable. Their private life grew into a structure that was careful by design. They established weekly check-ins about their relationship, time set aside to say what they wanted, what they needed, to name regrets or grievances before they calcified. They had rules about social media, explicit consent and no surprises. They saw a counselor once a month, someone recommended by a friend, who helped them pass the power dynamics and gave them tools to ensure the relationship remained voluntary, respectful, and rooted in choice rather than circumstance. Intimacy, when it arrived, felt like a conversation that had been promised and then kept. Their physical closeness came in slow scenes, a hand on the small of a back in the supermarket, a kiss in the kitchen that tasted like salt and coffee, a night when they let themselves sleep tangled and woke, knowing they had permission to be needy. Each step was preceded by words. Is this okay? Do you want this? And an acceptance that consent was not a single event, but a continuous thread. One evening, months after the altar spectacle, they hosted a small gathering of people they trusted, Julia among them, who had been witnesses to the arc that had started so public and had become private and then public again on their terms. The friends who came were a mixed, imperfect collection, co-workers, a few family members, and a handful of people who had refused to pity Beatriz or reduce her to a headline. There was laughter around a table, and later a slow conversation on the balcony about what had no longer been up for debate. "You chose to stay," Julia said softly, her voice both scolding and grateful. "You didn't stay because you had nowhere else to go. You chose to be here." Beatriz looked at Rodrigo. He took her hand without ceremony, the movement comfortable and true. "We chose to be here," he said. Together. They celebrated not a rescue, but a conversion. A transaction turned into an alliance. It was not without its oddities. Friends still asked awkward questions. The occasional stranger's stare could be sharp as a pin. But they had created a set of practices that made the stares less meaningful. The final friction came from the practical world of law, when the clock the lawyers had once set, 6 months, neared its end. The divorce papers that had been prepared as contingency had been mothballed. A notification arrived from the court. Unless contested, the window to file an uncontested divorce was closing. For a brief, crystalline moment, both saw decision crystallized into action. It would have been simple, if simple means painful. File, sign, put an end to what had been a legal fiction, and go on with separate lives. They sat at Rodrigo's kitchen table and looked at each other. The 6 months had done what months do. They had stretched the space between impulse and choice, and what was left was the truth of how they felt. "I thought I would want the divorce just to close the door," Beatriz said. "But I don't want to close it if it means closing a chance at something I didn't expect to want." Rodrigo reached across and took her hand. "Then we don't file," he said. "We keep what we have, and we make it ours." They informed the lawyers. The legal machinery exhaled in relief and filed the necessary notices to halt proceedings. The decision to remain married was legal, yes, but it was also a moral choice. It required them to take responsibility for the public consequences and to resist any temptation to obscure the power imbalance's risks. They volunteered additional transparency measures to the company and invited an external HR audit to ensure that promotions and decisions were reviewed impartially. Months later, once the storm had thinned into something manageable, they made the decision to have a proper celebration, not as a validation to the world, but as a covenant to one another. They invited a small number of people. They stood in front of friends and family, this time by choice rather than necessity, and exchanged vows that were not scripted by panic, but by intention. It was not a second legal marriage, but a reaffirmation, a ceremony that closed the loop on the scene at the altar by naming it for what it had been, a moment of improvisation that had led them here. Beatriz found catharsis in the act of saying aloud what she wanted now. I choose you because I want to, because you asked me to stay, and I chose to stay for me. Rodrigo said words that were both simple and true. I choose you because I have seen what it costs to stand by someone publicly, and I want to carry that cost with you, not for you. They did not pretend the past had not happened. They told stories at the dinner after the ceremony, careful, honest ones, about the first night in the hotel, about the first conversation in the corridor that had produced the kiss. Laughter leaked from the table when Julia recounted some small indignity. There were tears when Beatriz's father thanked Rodrigo for not letting the moment break his daughter entirely. Later, when they returned to the office, there were practical consequences. Records were adjusted, management lines made clear. Beatriz's role remained real and not performative. A few months after the reaffirmation, she was promoted again, this time with a title that meant authority and a salary that reflected responsibility. The press noticed, of course. There was commentary and opinion. But the story, by then, had more layers than a single frame. It could no longer be reduced so easily. When Rafael tried once more, this time with an attempt to insert himself into a legal narrative by claiming sanctimony, no one paid him much attention. He had become an X from a cautionary fable, and the world had moved on. He wrote an apology letter that was published in a small outlet. Beatriz read it once and then set it in a drawer. Closure arrived more in the shape of indifference than vindication. The months made them both different people. Beatriz learned how to accept help without feeling indebted. Rodrigo learned how to be vulnerable without using his power as armor. They had difficult conversations about the future. Children, reallocation of care duties, how to handle any power imbalance that might grow as he continued to rise in the company. They agreed, with the same practical clarity they had applied to legal paperwork, to consult a neutral counselor if any decision felt pressured by his position. They created a structure so consent remained a living thing, not a past agreement, but an ongoing conversation. There came a morning when they woke up in their apartment with sunlight across the floor and a plan for dinner neither of them had to consult a calendar for. Beatriz made coffee, and Rodrigo read the paper. They moved through the small, ordinary rituals, feeding a neighbor's cat when needed, responding to an email the way colleagues respond, concise, effective. It was a life built of tiny, unremarkable acts, and for them, that was enough. On the day the company released a formal ethics policy that included clearer guidelines on workplace relationships, Rodrigo stood in front of the executive team and spoke about responsibility in a voice that was firm and without theatricality. Beatriz sat in the third row, not behind him, but among peers who had argued for her promotion and had seen her work. When the press outlet asked for a comment, both she and Rodrigo provided a single statement that emphasized agency. They had chosen to be together, they had taken steps to ensure fairness in the workplace, and they asked for privacy as they moved forward in their lives both personally and professionally. People continued to talk. That is never going to stop, but the tone changed. It softened from accusation to reluctantly given respect. The narrative arc widened. They were allowed at last to become what they had been trying to be since the altar. Two people building a life with eyes open. On a simple evening, months after the ceremony, Beatriz and Rodrigo sat on their small balcony, a pot of basil between them, the city humming like a distant engine. She looked at him and at the way his face softened when he looked at her, a softness that had not always been there, and felt a clarity she had longed for. "Did you ever think you'd say yes?" he asked, half teasing, half serious. She smiled, the kind that reached the eyes now. "I thought I might be too proud to ever accept anyone's help," she admitted. "But you taught me that help and choice can coexist." She paused. "And I asked myself the question you wanted answered. Did I want this because I needed shelter or because I wanted a partner? The answer was never instant. It arrived slowly, in 1,000 small moments." He nodded, as if that was the only right way to answer. "Can I ask you another question?" he said. She leaned forward. "Always. Do you still think it was crazy, my offer that day at the altar?" She thought of the flash of cameras, of the hush that fell, of the sound of his voice over the organ. She thought of the way the world had made a spectacle, and the way they had returned it to life. "No," she said, "it was an unpolished, imperfect beginning, but it offered me a choice, and I said yes, to the person I wanted to be with, not to a rescue." He reached over and took her hand. It was a larger gesture now than when he had placed a pragmatic hand at her back in the church. It was a hand that had chosen and been chosen again and again. The question in the title, "Can she say yes?" had been answered not in a click of a decision, but as a slow unfolding of consent, of agency, and of shared responsibility. The yes did not erase the humiliation of the altar night. It did not pretend power had not mattered, but it turned the humiliation into a hinge, a pane that opened a door they could choose to walk through together. They sat there watching the city, planning small things, a trip in autumn, a promotion review, a weekend with friends, and the life they built seemed ordinary and miraculous at once. The cameras would still find them on occasion, the internet would still have its say, but inside their small apartment, with basil leaves in the sink and a stack of work briefs on the counter, there was something else that finally had its voice, a choice made clearly and kept deliberately. If you were watching from anywhere outside their windows, you might still ask whether it was right, whether the power balance could ever be clean, whether the choice was free. Those are good questions, and they deserve debate. For Beatriz and Rodrigo, the answer rested in the repetitive, ethical work of making their union voluntary, transparent, and fair. She had said yes, not because she had been saved in the way fairy tales promise, but because she had found a partner who asked for consent, honored it, and built structures to protect it. In the end, it was a complicated yes, the kind that acknowledges the cost and still chooses to invest in what comes after. If you have an opinion, would you accept a rescue like the one she received? Share it below. The choices we make in urgency often reveal what we want in the quiet that follows.